Nidhi Goyal, the founder and executive director, and I welcome all of you to this very important discussion today with a very eminent panel who would take us through what are the problems, what are the solutions, and what do we collectively need to do. Once again, welcome to those who have joined us on Zoom, to everyone who's watching us and have connected to this webinar through Facebook and through YouTube as well. You could ask questions or leave comments in the chat box on your respective platforms, and our team will collect it and ensure that we present it to the panelists towards the end. Um, we basically wanted to have this webinar in the 16 days, from 25th November to 10th December. Globally, 16 days are marked to amplify the discussions, to amplify action on ending gender-based violence. December 3rd is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. To mark both these moments together, we bring to you today this webinar on sexual harassment and how do women with disabilities end the silence. What's important for us was to really mark this campaign in multiple ways. From Shadows to the Center, Rising Flames 16 Days campaign in 2020 really takes us through the various pieces, the various forms of violence through various mediums. Public awareness campaign through our social media, looking at what specific forms of violence women with disabilities face because of the complex compounding of the gender and disability. What are the forms of violence that women with disabilities face that other women do, and how that impacts their identity, how that impacts their mental health, their well-being. What are the exit opportunities? You'll find some of these discussions happening every day on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. What we then decided to do was to hold workshops, now webinars, and also publications. We ran an editathon earlier in the campaign to again see where are women with disabilities and where's that violence that they face on two Wikipedia pages of persons with disabilities facing violence and that of women facing violence. And the gaps continued. Women with disabilities long have been slipping through the cracks. The situation, of course, becomes better by the day. The visibilization is more, a little more data every day exists or comes forth. And so we've definitely moved a couple of steps forward. But again, to ensure that this gap becomes lesser and lesser, we ran a Wikipedia editathon, a workshop, where youth with disabilities and people with disabilities basically came together, learned the skill of editing Wikipedia pages, to then become the creators of content and write about women with disabilities facing violence, the forms of violence, the exit mechanisms, and so on and so forth. The next, we are on 3rd of December on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. We again took from shadows to the center to another new space, that of publications. Those who have been connected with us, those who have been following us, those who have engaged. For us, it was very important that in 16 days, we look at 3 objectives. That to visibilize the violence that women with disabilities face, which is by amplifying their voices, by amplifying the forms, the specific nuances of violence. The second was really to work with people, that this violence, this kind of discrimination, this abuse is recognized, that this is happening. This is happening everywhere with women with disabilities in different spaces, in different forms. And the third objective, which is really the key objective also, is then, okay, what do we then do? We are here, we see the violence, we hear the violence, we experience it, we recognize it, we accept that that's happening. And now we want to create systems, we want to create safeguards so that women with disabilities can participate fully in all aspects of life, work, and everywhere else, with dignity, with respect, with all safety that they deserve. With these 3 objectives, we started our publication, where women with disabilities really came together. From 5 countries, we have 7 accounts of women with disabilities who've spoken up and said, "Me too." We started off on December 3rd and our series, the series continues. You can find the articles the first hand narratives of violence, experiences of sexual harassment that women with disabilities have faced within the disability community, particularly, which have been shared on our website, risingflame.org. We will be sharing those links here and also on email with all of you. But lastly, we are here today to then tie all of this together and say, reflect more and engage more deeply on all three objectives and say, okay, how do we then think about why is this violence invisible? What happens? What are the options that women have? What are the barriers in recognition? What is the barrier in accessing justice? And also then to think that what do these safeguards and systems look like? We're here today with a fantastic panel. It's I'm really excited and honored to have all three of our speakers here today, and I will introduce them in just a minute. We will be having this webinar for about 1.5 hours. You could already, those who have joined us now, you could keep writing to us in the respective chat boxes. So if you're on YouTube, Facebook, or in this webinar, you could leave questions and any queries that you had for our panelists, and we will present those to them towards the end in the Q&A section. We would have our panelists present for 15 minutes each, and then we would have about 25 minutes to engage with them directly for all our panelists to respond to your specific queries or specific questions around how to make this world a safer and a more inclusive and a respectful space for women with disabilities, with a single goal that women with disabilities now need to move from the shadows to the center. May I please invite our first panelist here today? And when I say I have three fantastic panelists, all very strong women, women who I've been honored to share the stage with, be friends with, be colleagues with, and so really excited to have, and all three of them are lawyers, so I should ideally be a little intimidated moderating this session, but I'm also equally excited to have all of them here and really honored to be introducing them now. The first speaker for the evening is Shikha Solomon Bhattacharjee. She's a researcher and a lawyer working in the global feminist labor justice movement. Her research and writing takes an interdisciplinary and a transnational perspective in understanding labor markets, migration, and variegated citizenship. Shikha's focus on female migration, female labor migration for employment, garment, and other domestic work and other formal works, provides a prism for understanding interactions between gendered social governance and legal, financial, and political regimes. Shikha, may I now please invite you to really share with us a global perspective on what does the labor justice movement and what does the sexual harassment of workplace look like? What does the ILO convention tell us about safety of women and workforce within the workspaces? Over to you, Shikha.
Thank you so much, Nidhi, and really excited to see Brinda and Amba as well. I think the last time the four of us were together was in 2018, so this is long overdue and much welcome. So just to zoom in and distill that long, generous bio that Nidhi gave, really what I focus on is and the ways in which the positions of different workers actually impact how they experience working conditions. And so in this particular webinar, what I'd like to focus on is the intersection of gender justice and also justice for disabilities. And so I'll start by kind of looking at what some of the barriers are to relief more generally for workplace violence, which are amplified for women with disabilities. And then I'd really like to spend some time on the new ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 on violence and harassment in the world of work. And this convention was negotiated at the International Labor Conference in 2018. It was negotiated by workers, employers, and states, and it was adopted in 2019. And the ILO Convention C190 actually breaks new ground because it brings the definitions of gender-based violence that are so well established and have been taken up in international law under CEDAW and brings them and extends them and applies them into the world of work. So this convention and the gains in ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 are actually really a moment of the labor rights movement and the women's rights movement coming together to get strong standards on workplace violence. Now, I think the challenge and what I hope you take away from the brief discussion that we have here is that we really need to push that convention to make sure that it not only responds to the needs of able-bodied and able women workers, but also meets the needs of persons with disabilities as well. So, as far as barriers to relief for workplace violence, one of the strongest barriers to relief for workplace violence are the relationships of power in the workplace. So when an employee is facing violence, and that can be in the form of physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and each of these types of harm are included in ILOC 190, ultimately they're in a position that oftentimes, in order to get relief, they either have to go to their employer or their supervisor, who is may be the perpetrator of violence, or they have to go to an outside authority who will implement those workplace protections. And so one of the first barriers to protection in the workplace are these relationships of power and the poor implementation of workplace protections. And these things are exacerbated for persons with disabilities because the general barriers to action are compounded by stereotypes, lack of procedural and reasonable accommodations that basically layer over the general issues of seeking relief for workplace violence with the types of discrimination in the workplace that persons with disabilities face. So I'm actually going to argue that ILO C190 and Recommendation 206 represent a framework for realizing a shared commitment among workers, employers, and states to end workplace violence. And I'm going to zoom in on what I think are 10 key provisions that take us in that direction. I'm going to start actually by first dropping the text of this and the citations into the transcript doc, so that as Roshni is taking this detailed transcript, it's a little bit easier. Roshni, can you give me edit access? I've just sent it to you. I think this might be easier.
Paste it in the chat box. I can paste it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Good to go.
Great. So I will actually be referencing particular provisions of ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 that I can use as a lever to advance protections from violence for women and girls with disabilities in the world of work. And I've pasted particular citations to those articles. They'll be in the transcript in case you'd like to reference them. So the first thing is that Article 5 of Convention 190 protects workers and other persons belonging to vulnerable groups that may be disproportionately affected by violence and harassment. And this is a wide encompassing lens that allows us to have a direct hook to push for the rights of women with disabilities in the workplace. The second prong is that Article 4 of Convention 190 calls for a gender-responsive approach to addressing violence in the world of work. So together we have the two prongs we need protection for particularly vulnerable groups, and a gender response under Article 4. And then, as I mentioned briefly, the definition of gender-based violence and violence in the world of work actually includes a range of practices that draws from the jurisprudence of CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, to include physical, psychological, sexual, and economic harm. And this provision protecting people from economic harm is particularly important in this moment of COVID-19 relief and recovery, because it does provide a framework that looks at withholding of wages, late payment of wages, non-payment of wages as an actionable form of violence that needs to be redressed. In addition to that, ILO C-190 calls for specific measures to address gender-based violence and harassment, including particular risk factors for gender-based violence and harassment, including discrimination and unequal relationships of power. And this is threaded throughout the text of the Convention in Articles 1, 4, 5, and 10. And I'm actually not mentioning the specific paragraphs of the recommendation because that gets into quite a lot of detail, but that is in the transcript if you'd like to go see. And then it calls for assessing and taking action to address occupational safety and health and related risks. And I think that thinking about how we assess occupational safety and health needs to really draw from the gains from the disability rights movement in thinking through accessible workplaces and making them safe, and not just safe in the terms of occupational health, but also in terms of freedom from certain types of violence. And so this is a place where implementation of C-190 can really, really benefit from a lot of the work that the disability rights movement has done. Now, another very important protection is that C-190 protects all workers, including temporary, contract, home-based, and apprentice workers. It includes workers in the formal sector and workers in the informal sector. And so what that does is it actually challenges states that ratify C-190 to think about how to create protections against all forms of gender-based violence and harassment in informal workplaces, and sets that as a benchmark and a standard. In addition to that, it extends protections from GBVH and other forms of violence to the entire world of work, including not only the workplace, but also commutes to and from work, which is a significant site of sexual harassment and violence, especially for women and girls with disabilities. And this is on under Article 3. It has protections for freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining as a means of preventing gender-based violence and harassment, and a mechanism calling for states to address violence in the world of work through regulations and policies that govern not only labor, but also non-discrimination, occupational health and safety, migration, criminal law, and all of those issues, because of the first provision that asks us to look at the position of vulnerable workers, need to be seen through the lens of how non-discrimination, occupational health and safety, migration and protection, criminal law protections in the workplace interact with protections against discrimination for persons with disability. And the last one that I've highlighted here comes in C-190 Article 10, and it calls for mitigating the impact of domestic violence in the world of work, including by considering risks of domestic violence as we do workplace risk assessments. And this seems to me a really important provision for us to take up at the intersection of gender and disability rights, because of the ways in which violence within the household, forms of domestic violence, can impact the capacity for women with disabilities to access and thrive in the workplace. So that's my pitch for why C-190 matters. It was a hard-won negotiation and standard, and I just want to conclude by telling you where we are and the next steps in making this standard really robust and having it work for us. So we need to ratify C-190 widely in India and around the world. Uruguay was the first to ratify. Argentina, Belgium, Finland, France, Namibia, and Spain have committed to ratify. So the convention into force. And trade union movements, especially prior to COVID 19, were beginning to launch ratification campaigns. And I think the challenge is to not lose sight of the gains that we made on issues of violence and harassment in the world of work pre COVID 19, but instead to recognize the ways in which the pandemic has actually heightened those forms of violence for so many communities, and to actually push forward with moving forward on this ratification, and then try to use this standard in COVID 19 pandemic response and recovery. And so then, once we win ratification, the next step will be to apply the convention through harmonization of national laws and through building the strength of the disability rights movement and also their intersection with gender justice and also the labor rights movement. So I think C190 was a moment where we saw the labor rights movement and the gender and the women's movement really come together to advance this standard. What we need to see is a robust inclusion and dialogue of disability rights activists and thinking through how to leverage these protections and also how to take gains from the disability rights movement and infuse it through this convention to protect the rights of vulnerable workers more broadly. Thank you so much.
Nidhi, you're on. We can't hear you. Yes.
I mean, okay, the software speaks and it starts listening to me. So thank you so much, Amba, for pointing that out. Shikha, thank you so much. And we really hope that we get a chance and we will get to spend at least a few minutes in the Q&A section to dive deeper into some of the provisions that you mentioned, but also, really looking at it as a joint responsibility. Having safe workspaces is a joint responsibility between the state, the organizations, and so on. And that's really, really important for us to know. And remember as we're taking this discussion forward. So also some more discussions and diving deeper into what it means in the informal workspaces, because many a times within the disability movement, it is a movement, but it is not always formal networks. It's not always formally working within organizations. There's a lot of voluntary work. There's a lot of engagement on an individual interest. As a person with a disability, you join hands and just sort of temporarily associate without any sort of formal contracts, commitments, and things like that. So just diving a little more deeper into that in the Q&A section would really help. And thank you so much for bringing those points here. We have, for everyone who's joined us a little late, we have live captioning, and the link has been pasted on all platforms on YouTube, Facebook, and here on Zoom. We also have Neha was interpreting for us, and we will switch our interpreters. Sarah is here, and so Sarah will be taking over for the next half an hour. Sarah, just indicate once if you're ready, and we're just going to spend 30 seconds doing the interpreter switch.
Yeah. I think I would try, I'd do by 6:45. I'll do the interview, then Sarah can take over. Is that fine?
Sure. Okay. So we'll continue. Yeah? Can we just do the switch and you can come back? We'll just keep a half an hour thing, and you can wait on me, huh, if we can take you back again.
I think I won't be coming back. I'll just log off after 45.
Great.
Is it okay?
So here we're just, thank you so much everyone for your patience, and we'll just move forward. And before we go to Brinda, our second speaker for this evening, just to also bring some of the accounts, the women with disabilities who have been writing across the globe. We have accounts of anonymous accounts, we have women who have written their names. We just have accounts where different forms of sexual harassment, within sexual harassment, different experiences by different people from the movement. And we're talking about the disability movement here within the workspaces when the disability movement is the workspace. and what kinds of harassment have been faced by women with disabilities. Some very important things that the women have brought up since December 3rd in our pieces is to say that there was power. There was a power equation when this harassment was faced. There was difficulty in speaking up. There was compulsion of continuing the association with the harasser still, even after the harassment was known, despite of one not wanting to engage, because it's a small movement. It's also because we're all working towards a cause and we wanted to take the cause forward. Some of them have spoken about hostility post, when they resisted the harassment and abuse, there has been intense hostility that they have faced from the perpetrator. And so there are various shades of experience. Grover is a lawyer, researcher, and a human rights activist based in New Delhi, India. Engages with the women's rights and human rights movement. As a lawyer, she specializes in constitutional law, criminal law, and human rights, and has appeared in landmark cases representing victims and survivors of sexual violence, communal conflict, extrajudicial executions, sexual minorities, human rights defenders, and media practitioners. Vrinda, we come to you and we request you to, shed more light on really specifically the Me Too movement and connecting it back to our publication and taking it into a certain direction of understanding the sexual harassment in workplaces. We always often as women with disabilities, we get asked that why are you speaking up in this way? Aren't there other legal routes that you could have taken? And so some of the questions about what are these legal resources, if we even, or recourses, if we even look at India, first, why, in your experience, women with disabilities chose, or women chose the Me Too movement and a certain way of speaking up. What are the legal recourses within India? And what are generally the barriers, or why do women choose or not to choose to take the legal road? And just lastly, a little about when women speak up, and we're particularly talking about this because women with disabilities are speaking up. It's just to understand what is that pushback and further violence, if at all, that women face when they speak up. So a little more about that. We would really love to hear from you, Vrinda.
Thank you, Nidhi. And first of all, thank you to Rising Flame for including me in this conversation. I'm here as much to learn and listen as to share a few thoughts with you. And it was a pleasure to hear Shikha put out this canvas and show us where further we can go in terms of finding both legal remedies and legal standards that are being set. Um, Before I jump into the Me Too, I just want to take forward a little bit of what Shikha mentioned in terms of our domestic law, where Shikha spoke specifically about the recognition of violence against women at the workplace being to now formally uh, crafted in terms of Convention 190 of ILO. And if we look at our domestic law, it's actually quite fascinating that emerging from the experience of Bhavri Devi, the Sathin in Rajasthan who was gang raped, the Supreme Court actually recognizes that women experience a very distinct and different form of violence at the workplace and links it to our constitutional rights, where in the famous Vishakha judgment of 1997, it was said that every act of sexual harassment is an act of discrimination against women. And therefore, it is a violation of Article 14, which is about right to equality, Article 19, specifically the freedom to practice any profession or occupation or carry out any business or trade, and Article 21, the right to life. So right from its inception, sexual harassment against women at the workplace has been linked to our fundamental rights and our constitutional right to equality. And I think that underpinning is very, very important because it helps to not allow the argument to get trivialized. As we do know, at least when I was young, and that was a long time ago, uh, we didn't have a vocabulary to say sexual harassment. It was called eve teasing. In Hindi, it was called chedchha, which in itself made it trivial, frivolous, and something that no one took seriously. So it was really also uh, finding a language, a vocabulary to express that violation. Again, in terms of definitions, both under Vishakha and what we have today, a statute, the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition, Redressal Act of 2013, the definitions are very broad and wide, whether it is the definition of employee, which will also include an intern, an honorary worker, a visitor. So it's not about the nature of contract of employment. The law takes care of that. And the definition of workplace, as in the convention, is again a very broad definition. Having put these little foundational blocks in place, and it took time, and as we do know, all of that came into being because women activists, women's rights movement pushed for it, whether in the Supreme Court or on the ground in getting those committees instituted in their institutions, their offices, or in getting the law in place. None of this was bestowed upon us by any state. We do, however, recognize the severe limitations that in practice women experience at the workplace. And I think the Me Too movement in many ways alerted us both to the limitations in the law, to the gaps in the law, as much as how simply the law being there on the statute book without a continuous engagement of our activism on each occasion was not going to give the confidence and break the kind of barriers that women face when they need to raise these issues. While the Me Too movement, as it's now referred to in India, comes on the back of similar speak outs that take place by women against very powerful men in the US, I do think it would be important for us to perhaps also place in context that women, even in India, have always spoken out. So I would actually, maybe it's a generation thing and somebody who's older, but I actually don't think that the Me Too movement in India necessarily was the first time women were speaking out. Let's remember Rupan Deol Bajaj, an IAS officer. So therefore, in all terms, a very empowered, capable woman who, when she had to protest against the sexual harassment by the head of police in Chandigarh, KPS Gill, she didn't have any law except to try and find her way through a criminal law and the Indian Penal Code, which didn't recognize sexual harassment in those terms. And that kind of speak out has taken place in our country by many, many brave women. We do know that in 2013, when the criminal law was amended, sexual harassment was made also a penal offense. So today you have sexual harassment, and it does not limit itself only to workplace sexual harassment. Any kind of sexual harassment, and the definition is very similar to the definition found in the civil remedy law. So today you can access a civil remedy within your in-house mechanism, and you have a criminal law provision. So it really depends on the location and how the woman wants to engage with it, and what kind of, and that would invariably depend on the support she gets. So what happens in the Me Too movement, and this is my understanding, is that it alerts us to the pervasive nature of sexual harassment. It points out to us that these are not one or two incidents that are happening occasionally. It also very, very importantly underlines that men in very powerful positions, very influential men, to sitting in positions of authority are constantly and in multiple ways over years misusing and abusing that power to perpetrate sexual harassment in diverse ways, from verbal to oral, right down to rape against women. So it also shows us that simply because a man is a great actor or a renowned author or even a great activist or a lawyer, it does not mean that that man cannot commit sexual harassment. And I think these are some things that it helped us reinforce. Women knew that from their individual experience, but it created a societal conversation around that. So you can be performing some very charming roles on television or on cinema screen, but at the same time, you can be committing sexual harassment. You can be writing profound articles in the newspaper or be a great writer or a poet. And sexual harassment will also be part of what you are doing, which leads us to the complexity of the issue. And because very often we know that these cases, these incidents are discussed far more in social forums rather than in the forums designed for them. So everybody will take a call, oh, I know him, he's a good man. So this good man, bad man syndrome that we have in our head, particularly in cases of sexual harassment at workplace, we need to break down and see more shades of gray and complexity that exist, and therefore learn to listen to women when they raise the complaint very differently, and perhaps unlearn the stereotyping and the prejudice and the fixations that perhaps many of us do carry and are unable to therefore hear the woman when she's talking. Moving quickly from there, it also pointed out the shortcomings in law. For instance, many women complain after decades they broke their silence. And many of those women were not particularly, they were working women, professional women in their own right, whether in Hollywood or in India. We saw those women raise these issues after decades. So that brings me to the point that the statute of limitation in the sexual harassment law, which says make the complaint within 3 months, maximum after 6 months, with the permission of the committee. What relevance does it have in the case of sexual harassment, and more so when your workplaces do not have committees that are there to take the complaint? So the woman is expected to file the complaint where? And yet the law of limitation is then used against her. So these are some areas where we need to speak in the future, and the Me Too movement is a learning for us. It also demonstrated to us perhaps that women are not feeling confident of going into these forums. What could those reasons be? They spoke out. When one woman spoke out, they found confidence in numbers. They felt that they will be believed. The biggest reason that at least I have heard from many, many women, I didn't speak because nobody was going to believe me against him. And that is not only because of your hierarchy within your workplace, which invariably does have the man sitting at the top of the pyramid, and therefore having greater power and authority. And the nexus of power that Shikha also referred to is a complex nexus inside a workplace where nobody wants, and it's also linked to employability. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to be siding with the woman who is making the complaint, because it could have consequences, and it does have consequences. A very large number of very courageous women who speak out, file complaints, tend to either some way or the other lose the job or be compelled to leave the job because the environment turns so hostile. So when women are standing up for their dignity and demanding redress, it is a very high cost that they are being made to pay. So to say to a woman, why are you silent? Please see what the consequences are and where are our mechanisms of support for her. My time is running out. I'm going to quickly come to the issue of slap suits. Women who speak out face severe consequences. I myself actually was sued in a civil suit for some absurd amount of 1 crore, along with the women who spoke out against R.K. Pachori, and a civil suit for defamation was filed. It takes a lot of resources to contest these cases. This has a chilling effect on women. We know today that Priya Ramani is facing a criminal defamation case from MJ Akbar. These are the tools by which women are silenced and intimidated, even though it is common knowledge, this kind of sexual harassment. I want to quickly speak very little to the issue of disability, about which I know very little, and I'm happy to listen and learn and engage further. But if you look at the reforms of 2013 under the Indian Penal Code and the Procedure Code, we see a very small introduction and acknowledgement that women with disability, when they are victims of violence, the law needs to think and make different processes for them. Also, in the substantive law, rape of a woman with physical or mental disability is seen as an aggravated offense today under 376(2) of the Indian Penal Code. Under the sexual harassment law, there is no acknowledgement of disability of any form whatsoever. We need to therefore see this as an aggravated form. Why do I say that? Because one of the first things that will confront you, and it confronts all women, and the situation will be further compounded in the case of disability. What is the evidence? What is the proof of sexual harassment? And women with disabilities will face an even greater challenge in order to meet this proof standard that the law will require. And therefore, unless you acknowledge the aggravated vulnerability, tackling the proof question will become very difficult, because sexual harassment at the workplace may not leave tangible material evidence that can be used. And therefore, I think what Rising Flame has raised today is an extremely important issue. We have not engaged with it. We have not worked hard enough, but it's something that we need to listen. And I personally would be very keen to engage with all of you to take this further, because I think it actually debilitates women from doing the work that they are doing. And we need to therefore take this issue very seriously and move ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vrinda. I'm just trying to think how to summarize what you said. But really, it's and again, we would really like to come back to you in the Q&A section to unpack a little more about the aggravated vulnerability, what are the best practices in law, and thank you for bringing forth really how women through the history have been speaking up, facing different barriers, but have been speaking up before, and acknowledging that nexus of power. Shikha and you both spoke about it, but really important, and becomes even more complicated in terms of disability when it comes to people with disabilities, women with disabilities, and what does this nexus of power even look like, right? As a disabled woman, and people often say it's like a double marginalization, and I think it's far more complicated than that. Power never comes in an additive value, and this chilling effect that women have when they see the consequences or the backlash that other women speak. And so how do you then, when you're already disabled, and socially, workspaces, everywhere, opportunities are really few. And we know that for women with disabilities, particularly, starting from families to really going into workspaces, academics, education, everywhere, when opportunities are really few, what are you then negotiating, right? When there is this full nexus of power around you. So just to explore a little bit of more of what are the current legislative frameworks and some of the practices, some successes, etc. We'll come back to that. And so thank you so much. I'm again now finally going to switch over the interpreter. So just going to wait for 5 seconds. And Sarah, please just unmute yourself and tell me that you're ready. And then I'll introduce our third and final speaker, Ambassador.
I'm ready. You can go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Neha, and handing over to you, Sarah. Our third speaker for the evening and the final speaker of this panel is Amba Salalkar. Amba Salalkar, a friend, a colleague, a woman with a disability like me, but also really a very, very prominent lawyer focusing on rights of persons with disabilities and building capacities of disabled people's organizations or organizations of persons with disabilities. Since August 2020, she has been working with the International Disability Alliance as the Bridge CRPD SDGs officer at the Capacity Building Unit. She's also the co-founder of Parvai Advisors, which supports organizations in compliance with legal provisions around the inclusion, just a second, co-founder of Parvai, which supports organizations in compliance with legal provisions around the preservation of diverse and inclusive workspaces. And diverse and inclusive workspaces, of course, also means diverse, inclusive, and safe workspaces. So with that, we come to you, Amba, to really come to you to ask, how do we then look at these setting up safeguards and changing of systems within disability spaces, and disability community and space is a workspace, right? But also in other workspaces, that so that women with disabilities can function fully and make contributions with equality, dignity, and safety. Over to you, Amba.
Thanks, Nidhi. I'm happy to be here and able to wear my two hats. And so this is, it's an area which many of us have been working with over the last few years. And so before I go into like looking at safeguards, I just want to spend a little bit of time going back to the question of the nature of sexual harassment of women with disabilities at workplaces. Now we know that the majority of women with disabilities, where they are employed, work in the informal sector. And this is, in general, 85 to 93% of the population works in the informal sector. So it's probably much higher for women with disabilities. But even when we look at the nature of sexual harassment that women with disabilities have reported, and I'm saying this based on my experience working with DPOs in India and talking about gender violence, that if you look at the nature itself, it's quite different than the kind of sexual harassment cases that I have seen, for example, working with, corporate or institutions or universities. So for example, I can give you one example of, if we say, there was a case that someone told me about deaf women who were employed at a particular workplace, and male employees who were not deaf were routinely abusing these women behind their backs. So as the women would pass by, they would say obscenities to them, which the women obviously could not hear, but the co-workers heard, and the co-workers found this super offensive. But for the women, they felt that they were not comfortable to complain because ultimately they had not heard it, and they did not believe that their colleagues would sort of stand up for them. We also have, there are instances where you could have things which are brushed off as curiosity, and this sort of links to the fact that people with disabilities are only seen as their impairment, and so asking them about anything is kind of fair game. So for example, there was an instance where several women with psychosocial disabilities were asked about the impact of medication and their impairments on their sex life by another person who was within the sector. And it was a very odd situation because it was like, is this a question? Is this necessary? But this is really the issue that happens. And this is the issue where, when we think about what a reaction of somebody outside the sector would be, there is no confidence in that process. If we, if we look at like the other risks of for women with disabilities in the workplace, if we look at field workers or women with disabilities who work for DPOs or federations and who engage in field work, they are vulnerable to facing sexual harassment where they go. And we know that under the sexual harassment law, it's only if you make a complaint against someone who is an employee of an organization that you can, that, that the offense can be taken up. But effectively, when things happen in the field, this gets signposted, which means that you have to go to the police or you have to go to some other authority. And the point is well taken that, under the amendments in 2013, which many of us had worked on, sexual assaults of women with disabilities are looked upon as aggravated. But I can point to, for example, the Human Rights Watch report that Nidhi, of course, had worked on, to say that even though there have been all of these changes, women with disabilities are still finding it very difficult to access justice. The third site of sexual harassment that I would want to speak about is at conferences and meetings, because this comes up quite a lot, where women with disabilities often find themselves in situations where they are at a conference or a training and that they meet people who are not from their organization, and they experience sexual harassment. And in those issues, there are often these questions of where do we file complaints, and what happens in those cases when we experience this. These are small circles, these are small movements, as my co-panelists have already raised. And the other issue, of course, which exists for women with disabilities is this issue of the impact of making complaints. There is, we came across an instance where a woman with a spinal cord injury told us about how she was going to a physiotherapy class on a regular basis. And every time she went for the class, she was going by auto, and the auto driver would help her get in and out of the rickshaw. And she experienced sexual harassment by the auto driver while he was helping her in and out of the rickshaw. And she did not make a complaint about this for months together, and she never did eventually, because she felt that if this was exposed to her family, they would be so scared that they wouldn't send her out anywhere. And this is the reality of a lot of women with disabilities who go against family expectations and stress levels, and go out there to make to find themselves a place. And this is something which weighs very heavily. Now, when I turn to the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act, there are some issues that stand out. One is the fact that this law applies to organizations with 10 or more employees. And the reality is that if we look at small organizations of persons with disabilities, often they do not have 10 employees. And so they often feel that they are exempt from this, that doesn't mean that small organizations do not have obligations. But there are other constraints as well. For example, organizations have very, very low funding. They have funding for their activities. And if it's a question of having compliance with these laws, often they don't have funding to organize for external trainers or to pay for an external member. What's the consequence? The consequence is that you get an external member that you know. And I know this because I have been approached to be an external member for many organizations. But the fact is, if you look at the role of the external member in internal committees, it's to bring this perspective of no bias, right? It's to make sure that there's no bias. But the fact is that because of the lack of social capital, often organizations are just, forced to just rely on people that they know. And this presents a problem. Even where you have policies, if you look at the kind of formats which are available online, so if an organization needs to be in compliance, they download something which is available online, which is fine. except that these formats often do not have provisions like reasonable accommodation for complainants. And what happens is, because of that, is when it's not found in the policy, IC members often do not know that this exists. And so the issue is that complainants do not receive the supports that they need to make complaints. For example, again, there was a deaf woman who faced a disciplinary inquiry, and she was working in an office where she was not provided with a sign interpreter. She was able to do her work, but even for the inquiry, she was not provided with a sign interpreter. And this is something which is highly problematic because she could not understand what was being said against her. Linked to this, when you train internal committee members, which is very important, this training does not reflect the bias that they may have with regard to women with disabilities. So often when we look at trainings of IC members, they often talk about, okay, the bias that we have about who is a victim and how does a victim behave and things like that. But for women with disabilities, many able-bodied people have preconceived notions. One of these is that women with some disabilities may not be reliable witnesses. The other is this notion that women have to be sexually desirable in order to be harassed. And women who do not fit into your understanding of what is sexually desirable are not capable of being harassed. This is something which a lot of people believe. We say, if you've been a fly on the wall in a meeting, in an IC meeting, many times people say, why would he harass this woman? You know, his wife is beautiful, or things like that. The other important thing that I want to highlight is that it is a reality that if you go to an event, if you make a complaint of sexual harassment against someone in an organization, many of us are aware of the fact, and this has happened in the past, that organizations can have their funding frozen or their resources taken away from them when a case of sexual harassment comes to light. And this is really important because this provides a disincentive for organizations to take up cases of sexual harassment. And this is very serious. And I can tell you this, I mean, not to make this about myself, but I'm comfortable enough to share this, that I faced sexual harassment at a conference in 2015, which was funded by, you know, it was a foreign funded conference. And when I was considering later on to raise the complaint, it was very, very clear to me that this could result in something really terrible for the organization. And the person who harassed me was not an employee of the organization, but as the host, they might have been caught in the middle of this. And from a global perspective, we know that this has happened in the past. The DPOs have had their funding frozen when cases of safeguarding have come to light or have not been addressed properly. The other aspect with regard to safeguarding, I think, which is important to raise, is that often women with disabilities are excluded from training. And this is a reality that I was not aware of till very recently, that where you have complex arrangements of employment. So many people with disabilities get employed through job fairs or through organizations which promote employment. But for example, if a person with a disability is working at, say, a particular hotel, the contract of employment is not between the hotel and the person with the disability. The contract is with a third party, which provides, let's say, housekeeping or other services. As a result of this, the burden on who should be training these people with disabilities is unknown. So it loses through the cracks. Instinctively, I would say that where they work, they have to be trained, but in practice, it doesn't work like that. And this is something which is hugely problematic. Added to this, organizations which work on employment of persons with disabilities do not proactively encourage these, especially women with disabilities, to be trained because they are trying to get them employed. And to further add complexity, there are organizations who bona fide believe that if you train women with disabilities on issues relating to sexual abuse or harassment, that you are, quote unquote, I'm making air quotes here, putting ideas into their head. And this is the reality that we have to work with. I have a couple of minutes left, but I just want to sort of take that and I want to just focus on these solutions that I see. One is around supporting disabled people's organizations to build their capacity around safeguarding women with disabilities who either work with them or are their members or beneficiaries. And this has to be something that has to be supported, externally. So in terms of organizations, there need to be resources available to them so that they can implement processes which are unbiased, which are really rooted in what the POSH Act is really envisaging. The second is, how do we make sure that no one is left behind when it comes to awareness and training? And women with disabilities are perhaps at greater risk at experiencing sexual harassment for a variety of reasons, some of which have already been addressed before, but also because they are seen to be less likely to be able to access the system. And so we need to prioritize their training when it comes to awareness, when it comes to like how the process is supposed to go, including, organizing peer support, because women with disabilities who work in organizations, mainstream organizations, often report a sense of being isolated. And so building peer support is something which is really important. A lack of peer support would make someone even more vulnerable to abuse. And the third point that I would like to raise, and just finish that, is how do we look at building the capacity of women with disabilities to play the role of external members in organizations? We talk a lot about nothing about us without us. I think that a strong way in which we can ensure that organizations are more receptive when it comes to, or more prepared when it comes to, cases involving people with disabilities, is that we make sure that, women with disabilities are also trained, in the skills required to be an external member. We know that there is a huge demand on presently people who are available to be external members, and women with disabilities who have backgrounds in law or social sciences or NGOs are absolutely qualified to be that. We just need to make sure how can we leverage that. So these were some initial thoughts, but I generally do better in Q&A, so I look forward to that. But thank you very much. Thanks, Nidhi.
Thank you so much, Amba. And it's so interesting you mentioned the Human Rights Watch report. The two co-authors and the reviewer are all three on this call in the webinar. Shikha and I co-authored the report, and Amba, you reviewed the report. And it's really talking about sexual violence, the criminal law amendment, and access to justice, and the barriers and implementation. So really to think about what access to justice means, but I think really to come to the solutions that you provided, Amba, or some of the suggestions and recommendations of what could change is really important. And very often you're correct, when we talk about capacity building, we talk about, okay, let's train DPOs to understand sexual harassment, but really truly building capacity so that systems can change from within, where women with disabilities are sort of not just, we're not externally saying, okay, now remove these barriers and accessing mechanisms, or make mechanisms and legal provisions more accessible or inclusive. We're also saying is that women with disabilities come in the space of decision making, and that's how we sort of circle around the full participation piece. But I would really like to also say that, thinking about the stigma and really coming from the space of stigma. So when it comes to women facing harassment, there's so many questions, and they're commonly known that it could be your fault, you're making a big deal out of a small issue. Yes, Amba, I'll come to the questions. I've also noted them, and of course I will end up missing a few, so there I'll need all the panelists' support. But I'm just coming to one or two questions from the Q&A box. Here, the stigma around women with disabilities basically is really immense, and we need to remember that as a premise, right? Not just see that, but remember it as a premise from where There is a quote unquote normalization of harassment or naturalization of harassment. If you will use, one of our pieces coming up, the woman with a disability speaks about naturalized sexual harassment within networks and organizations. Um, just creating a safe environment for women exercising their own right, and so on and so forth. Just to say that the meetings and conference piece, Amba, that you spoke about, and on 3rd December, the piece that was published was written by me, where I also shared a larger picture, but also spoke about, I having faced, um, persistent harassment from somebody within the community, and really reached a third conference where it wasn't by the person who was harassing me, but how then, the sort of impact of you have to choose whether you need to attend the conference. Do you want to be a part of this very important work that you want to do, or you want to just remain safe? And it's really, and I'm using all the words very carefully, you just want to remain safe, right? Like it's really almost becomes an issue around this. So how do you make those choices? And you'll see that an article again later where a woman speaking out from Guatemala, who's a former CRPD committee member, speaks of the same thing, that sexist remarks, macho humor, abuse, all this was common. And so, if I had to be in very important negotiations, it was literally a choice between whether I could be there and work, or whether I just chose to be safe. So these very difficult choices, in the absence of what safeguarding mechanisms look like, or implementation, or really, you know, is there really a consequence-free? And Vrinda also spoke about it. Shikha spoke about the power relationships. And so how is this sort of exercising is really important to see. But something very basic that I'd like to begin with in the Q&A, and really for either of you to respond, and then I'll come to two more questions. One is really to say that many a times the understanding of sexual harassment isn't built. It's really, and complaining becomes even more difficult, or reporting becomes difficult, because it's really about, okay, but it just happened once, or it's only a brush here, or it's only one couple of comments like this. So this trivializing, and maybe Vrinda, I could go to you. How do we understand, as people who've signed into this webinar, as women with disabilities, as the people who want to ensure safe environments for women and women with disabilities, how do we understand these forms of sexual harassment? Is something that I wanted to ask you.
Just repeat the latter part. The voice dropped, so I missed that.
Yeah, no, just Vrinda, how do we understand these different forms when it gets to trivializing an experience, right? Around, okay, but this is just touching, or this is just, these are just sexist remarks, or verbal comments. Why are you getting so affected, or what are these really? Why would they even fall under sexual harassment, right? So how do we understand, really, as people who are on this call, as women with disabilities who are hearing and want to learn, how do we understand these forms within sexual harassment? And what is this little sexual harassment, and trivializing, and more serious ones? Are there such shades, and how do we recognize those?
Well, I think the one very important signal that this Vishakha judgment gave was that what is unwelcome, and what is unwelcome for the woman. It is not whether the office crowd thinks that this is a joke, which I didn't have the sense of humor to laugh about, because you were making fun about, my body parts, or it's not whether socially these things are considered kosher. I know everybody, Bombay film industry makes songs about it. The law very clearly says it is unwelcome to the woman, because this is about her dignity and how she perceives it. So actually the strength of sexual harassment lies in the wide canvas of misconduct that it flags. And it actually, the purpose behind it is to create an ongoing conversation. While we have today spoken more about how do women, what do you do? How do you prove? What are the challenges? Why do women not speak out? To my mind, one of the things, while we address those issues, and I think Amba spoke to some of the very crucial ones and underlined them for us, I think we also need to pay equal attention to the preventive role this will play. And that is where the definition of sexual harassment that can go from a wink, a whistle, a message, to molestation, groping, sending innuendos, making catcalls, touching without permission, as well as rape. Everything comes within this very broad phrase, sexual harassment. And therefore, one uses it actually to create a conversation in every workplace. And it may, at times, the workplace may be too small, so maybe conferences, etc., are also leveraged to have this conversation, because what we really are up against is the entire culture of patriarchy, which normalizes it, routinizes it, and trivializes it at the same time. So we think, all of us as women, we know, we think like, should I say this? I know I'm uncomfortable. Should I keep quiet or should I say it? Apart from the fact that we may doubt ourselves and say, oh, did this really happen, or did I feel it happen? Or, you know, maybe I was a little sensitive there. And I think we don't trust ourselves, and we don't believe in ourselves. And that is the culture we need to counter. And therefore, conversation, which is an obligation under the law, and which Amba referred to, that resources may be scarce. So who will take that responsibility? How will those conversations, those workshops, which are preventive in nature, so that we're not only focusing on the few complaints that come forward, but change the culture into a culture where there is respect and dignity for women, and they can be, they can do their work without having this nagging at the back of their mind.
Right. Thank you, Vrinda. I will move to the next question quickly. Amba, if you could respond to this. You've referred to some, you've spoken about it a little bit. The question is, as a blind woman, I had sexuality education in my school, but I could not understand anything as they were so visual. Even now, being 16 and in the last year of my school, I don't know even the basics. And what does violence against women and sexual harassment mean? And I think that there might be many people like myself, given this lack of awareness, how should we as disabled women know about all of this, particularly when we cannot see? So really, I mean, I just thought access to information, if you could sort of elaborate a little more on that, and how we could, as individuals, organizations, women with disabilities ourselves, how do we work around this?
So first of all, I think Rising Flame is much more qualified to answer this question than I am. Because this is it's an anonymous person, but I can tell you, first of all, you don't need to be scared asking this question, and it's not off topic, because I think it's very linked, that we have to teach people about sexuality and the positive aspects, as well as issues like sexual harassment and violence. Often, where available, women with disabilities get some information on violence and harassment, but not on, what could be, I suppose, more positive. And I think that is a problem. But please don't be embarrassed for asking this. This is a reality. But what I think is that it's very true that, I just want to reiterate that genuinely people think that women with disabilities will not be sexually harassed, and that we would be putting ideas in their head if we train them. And that, the idea of what is a visual or what is an accessible training on sexual harassment is really important, because when, a sexual harassment training, people will say, okay, if somebody is making a gesture, an obscene gesture to you, or somebody is, standing too close to you, it may be something very different if you are a woman with a disability, what that would mean. And I think that that's something which, it has to be something which is relevant to everyone. If I can put it like ambitiously, a universally designed training around sexual harassment is something that we have to think about, because it's not, like for those of us who are autistic, sometimes it does not really register when people are making, like people are doing things which would make me uncomfortable. But there is a time at which I don't get I don't it doesn't really strike me, and this is like the hallmark of my experience. But I think that's something which is relevant to everyone. And if you are working somewhere where where it's not relevant, or you are not able to find it accessible, you should be able to get your doubts addressed. And now I'm going to turn it to you, Nidhi, to talk about what you guys do.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amba. And I think it's a very important question. So um, just to say that, okay, so one of the trainings that I was conducting a couple of years ago, at one of the blind schools, right? Really, when I was discussing and training them on sexual harassment, and we started speaking about street sexual harassment, and they said it doesn't happen to us. And of course, I wasn't using the word street sexual harassment. I broke it down for them, and we were talking about it, and they said nothing like that happens to them. And then I switched the subject, and I said, okay, let's think, how do you come to school? So I made it about accessibility, and I said, okay, how do you come to school? And they said, we walk, and we take a train, and then we walk from the station here, and there's a big crossing near the school, right? And so I said, okay, there's a 4-lane crossing. How do you, not 4-lane, sorry, there's a charaha, so like a intersection, right, cross section. So I said, how do you cross that very difficult, horrible traffic patch? And you would definitely need help? And they said, yeah, we just ask anybody who's free and could assist. And so the conversation came to, they seek assistance from strangers because of lack of infrastructure accessibility. And then I asked them if any of the stranger had tried to touch them while they were not comfortable, on their body, or hold them too tight, or like touch their breasts or anything like that. And they said, oh, that, Didi, that happens all the time. And then I paused and I said, this is what we were unpacking. Isn't this sexual harassment? And they said, no, 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 this is not sexual harassment. This is because we are blind. And so this, pointing the blame on women, it's always about, oh, you were wearing short clothes, or you sort of somehow your behavior was too friendly. So what we do for women and for women with disabilities is that we somehow want to shift the onus on them. Here, it's even more tricky because we have so many negative associations with the disability that we're constantly, there's reduced self-worth, there's constant rejection from families, from society, in for many women with disabilities, that when you say, oh, this is not harassment, this is behavior that you have to tolerate because you're disabled, it becomes very, very complicated, because then how would the recognition of sexual harassment come in? How would you even, there is a huge shift that you have to make. So really working that way is really important for us at Rising Flame. We engage in sexual harassment and building capacities in different ways, but I do want to say that we will be again restarting. So we ran consent workshops because we feel like framing all of this under consent. Consent is generally just seen in Bollywood in terms of like romance, and everywhere else in terms of romance. And consent is seen in disability sometimes as caregiving consent. Sometimes, I'm not even saying, not that everybody thinks that they need to ask us before assisting us or providing any care or support or anything. But just how to then look at consent really holistically, to unpack not just romance, but to unpack violence, to build capacity on what this agency and autonomy will look like. So we launched this series a couple of years ago, and because now there's a pandemic, we will start an online series late January, early February. So watch out for our social media. This is a capacity building, these will be series of workshops. So um, really, or you could leave your coordinates with us and we will get in touch. But all those of you who are listening and are not on Zoom, you can also write to us at team@risingflame.org and continuously engage with us on social media to understand how else we're here having this webinar. And this is really, again, a part of building capacities, building awareness, and so on and so forth. I'm going to quickly move to another question, which I want to take to Shikha. And Shikha, could you tell us a little more about, and I mentioned this earlier, about how do we understand safety and dignity at work within informal workspaces, and how is the state obligation, these two connections of, it's a joint obligation and also within informal sector. So how do we look at that? Because that prism will help us understand how to even look at safety within disability networks, disability work, within, conferences with third parties, within, voluntary spaces, and so on and so forth.
Challenging question, Nidhi. So I'm going to back up for 1 second and just add something to a previous question and then transition into this one. On the question of how to address trivialization of forms of violence, I do think that the way in which ILO Convention 190 defines violence and harassment. And so I'm bringing this up because this goes beyond sexual violence and sexual harassment, but any form of violence and harassment, is that it defines it in relationship to the impact of the behaviors and practices. So, for instance, it's not whether it is a wink or a form of speaking behind someone's back. It's not the action itself, but it's the result. Does it result in physical harm? Does it result in psychological harm? Does it result in sexual harm, or does it result in economic harm? And with these as the frames, it really centers the person who's experiencing that harm, because you look at whether or not something constitutes violence based on whether or not it creates a harm. So I think that that standard may be helpful in addition to the other standards that were offered in recognizing violence beyond just sexual violence and sexualized modes of violence. Then in terms of the question of how you can expand and extend labor rights in the informal sector, um, that's the broader question that you're asking in some ways. And that is an extremely challenging question. And the beginning part of that question is really thinking through mechanisms about how you formalize those labor relationships to begin with, so we can push and move towards accountability. So if we need to look at questions like contracts, we need to look at issues like actual standards in the informal sector on wages. And once you start to develop those sorts of standards and then work on enforcing them, you begin to move in the direction of, rather than having this kind of black box of the informal sector, having more of an inroad into which there's some structure for accountability. But in terms of the employment relationship, thinking through how to move toward contract or formalized work is really part of the direction that we need to go. And this is not easy at all. And it's an area that WeGo is doing tremendous work in thinking through, for instance, domestic workers and other issues, and other informal sector workers, how we can move in that direction. There's some work in terms of thinking about how even in the formal sector, with the increased use of short-term employment contracts, et cetera, the protections for workers, even within places like factories, are increasingly looking like informal sector work. So that doesn't answer your question, but let me give somewhat of an answer after I explain the complications there. We need to move towards collectivization. So we need to move towards informal sector workers coming together into frameworks where they can negotiate and bargain collectively in order to create standards. And so there are models of this with the International Domestic Workers Federation and unions of domestic workers that are forming. But in order to have the capacity to negotiate and bring the regulatory apparatus into the sector, to the extent that we face challenges in having law enter a deregulated space, one way of pushing back is through organizing that space at the level of the worker. And so finding opportunities to collectivize. And I think this is really, really important in thinking through how we make sure that persons with disabilities are included in that. Because we know that the disability rights movement is constantly pushing for the inclusion of perspectives and disabled persons in these larger organizations. And so I think we need to build more bridges between workers' movements and disability rights movements. And I think there's a lot to be mutually gained from extending those alliances. And those are some of the broader picture areas of work that we need to do. We also need standards like ILO Convention 190 that sets the standard that we have to pass laws, policies, regulations, and the programs to support protections in the informal sector. So it's kind of like from the top, we need to be pushing for standards within the informal sector. And from our movements, we need to be collectivizing to think about how to implement those things. And bit by bit, conversations like this are a really important start, I think, in even making the issues visible, thinking about how to bring people together. That's all I have on that difficult question for now.
Thank you so much, Shikha. Really gives us a lot to think about, what all three of you have really shared with us today, because of course this is just a start, and there is a long way to go, but we really need to start and make a push seriously, and many actors have been in their different capacities within the movement, within the sector, trying to bring these conversations forward, and so ours is an attempt to add to that. There is another question, and this is really open to whoever would like to respond. It's about trans people being left out of the act. And so transgender women, particularly, how do they address sexual harassment cases? Because this will also help us understand more deeply around trans women with disabilities, trans persons with disabilities, and how do then multiple intersections, and of course legally but socially, how can they seek redressal or seek protection under the law?
Sorry, Nidhi, did you want one of us to answer that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was like, I'm not open to either of you, whoever would like to respond to this.
So one thing, and I know that people, that there's a difference in opinion on this, but, I see the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act as to be a minimum. And I think that organizations are free to build on it. So we have in the past, when I say we, I mean my Parva advisors had, organizations have adopted, policy, gender neutrality in policies to be inclusive of trans persons. And I think that it is true that trans men, trans women, men who present to be from the LGBTI community often can be very susceptible to comments, etc., which make them feel unsafe, sexual harassment at the workplace. And I think that while the law is not there, the law specifically talks about the complainant to be a woman, and that, I read it, and I could be wrong, but the respondent term is kind of gender neutral. But the complainant has to be a woman, sexual harassment of women at the workplace. But organizations can and have, there are plenty of organizations that have taken a more gender neutral approach to be more inclusive. However, I think that making sure that we recognize the power imbalances that exist is something which is extremely important. And that is something which is taken up when you do training and when you actually work with the internal committee. So it's really important that, you get a balance of that. But perhaps we don't have enough time to unpack that fully. Sorry.
Right.
I can just add very briefly to what Amba says, which I agree with most of it. And yes, even universities actually made it gender neutral, from Delhi University to JNU. Of course, this act actually came in and muddied the waters more. Vishakha gave much more space to do things. Specifically on trans women, even if I was to do, as Amba says, this is a minimal, it's a baseline. Trans women can, even under this act today, file a complaint. Delhi High Court, even in cases of sexual violence, is saying that yes, it's about women, so why can the trans woman not get protection? So I would say the space is available, but on the larger point, I do think that the law needs to, particularly in training, in illustrating it, needs to acknowledge and comprehend the specificities of the kind of sexual violence and sexual harassment that trans women would experience, which would be different also. So with the court saying they need to be given jobs, etc., I think it's important to accommodate. I'm not a votary of gender neutrality. I'm a votary of gender specificity, which means that you acknowledge the diverse ways in which that kind of sexual violence is perpetrated. And I think just changing it into person is actually almost blind to that kind of sexual harassment, which a trans woman would experience very differently from other women.
Okay. Thank you. I'd just like to circle back. We've run out of time. We're 5 minutes over time. I'd just like to come to all three of you in the same order for any closing remarks. And this is really a conversation starter, but very important conversations and very important things unpacked today. So Shikha, if I can come to you first.
Only thing I have is a big thanks to you, Niti, and the Rising Flame team for this beautifully executed webinar and for bringing us together to have this conversation. And I look forward to participating in the conversations that developed from what I think was a really productive session in thinking through lessons from the labor rights movement more broadly, the experience of the resistance to sexual violence and harassment, specifically in India, and the zoom in that Amba completed for us on how these issues play out for women and girls with disabilities. So thank you, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Shikha. Vinda, if you had any last comments, we'd really like to hear from you.
I also will only add my thanks to Nidhi and to be able to hear Shikha and Amba and everyone at Rising Flame. I will just say this, taking off from what Shikha mentioned, I think it's very important for us in the women's rights movement, and the disability rights movements, to see women, I sometimes think that the word intersectionality, I'm no longer sure how much it's actually being comprehended in its larger understanding. But the women's rights movement has everything to gain or lose with what's happening, for instance, in the farmers' protest. Particularly on the issue of sexual harassment, what Shikha said, your nature of employment is going to further enhance or diminish your vulnerability at the workplace. Therefore, sectoral work is important, but cross-thinking and being able to form larger understandings. If you have a whole place where labor codes are destroying trade unions, what kind of support are we going to find in workplaces for sexual harassment? So women's rights movements will have to see, will have to form alliances and engage with many more, even as they focus on the specificities that they are engaged with. And once again, thank you for this, and I hope we keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rinda. Amba, for any closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I think it's always a pleasure listening to Rinda, and it's been great meeting Shikha after all this time. And I think that it is, we don't know when things are up for amendment. Things happen very quickly. And I think that, like if there is, every once in a while, there's a murmur about amendment of the Preventing Sexual Harassment Act as well. And I think that that would be a really good, I think that in the sense that if there's an intention, if there's mind space to amend a law, I think that, looking at, how, if we don't want that, we don't want, a law to be touched because we don't want to compromise the gains that it has got. I would like to see how we can incorporate this through maybe rules or maybe like other means in which we can make it more, we can recognize these aspects of inclusion and intersectionality so that they become part of like process. But having said that, the law is supremely underutilized. And so, yeah, I think that's the first step, making sure that people are aware and use it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shikha. Thank you, Vrinda, and thank you, Amba. This has really been so interesting, and we've all learned so much from different movements, from different experiences, from all your perspective. I can't thank you enough for coming to Rising Flames webinar and really adding your expertise and experience to this event and making this a very rich and insightful event. I'd really request everyone who can um, turn on their cameras, and particularly the panelists, if you could be on video for a minute, to just take a couple of group pictures before we thank our support team and sign off. Okay, one of the Rising Flame members will be taking the screenshot and telling us it's done.
We're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you once again. I would also like to thank our sign interpreters, Sarah and Neha. Thank you so much for, again, making this event accessible. Thank you, Roshni and Fiza, for live captioning this event. Thanks, a big thanks to the entire Rising Flame team, Srinidhi, Chenika, and everybody else who has made this event happen. Thank you so much. And we would really want to thank everyone who's engaged in this event for all your questions, and stay tuned because our panelists have given us many more ideas to run with capacity building programs and really bring in some more work, more dedicated, more specific, to ensure that we're making spaces, workspaces particularly, very inclusive, safe, accessible, and diverse for women with disabilities, for people with disabilities, and then on the whole, as a community. So thank you everyone, and please stay tuned for all of you who would like to sign up or who have already signed up. We'll see you tomorrow for a webinar on domestic violence. We again have a very fantastic panel from all across the world. You'll hear from women with disabilities from Africa to America and Indonesia, so Asia as well. And we'd really like to take this conversation of the shadow pandemic forward. So tomorrow, same time, 6 p.m. India Standard Time, we'll see you again for a webinar on the shadow pandemic, domestic violence and women with disabilities. Do watch out for our publication series. Many of the articles have been published and we have one or two more to go. And we really thank you for all your engagement, and we hope that together we can take these conversations forward.